What would you do if a woman stepped onto a plane, elegant, calm, and simply asked to pre-board for medical reasons, only to be met with a cold stare and a condescending reply? You seem fine. You don't look sick at all. What if I told you that woman was a neurologist, battling a rare illness attacking her own nervous system, and was on her way to receive a national award recognizing her work in medicine? And what if, just minutes later, she collapsed in first class, while the same flight attendant who mocked her simply turned away? This isn't a movie. This isn't clickbait. It happened on a real flight with real people and real choices, and the woman at the center just happened to be the wife of the airline's CEO. In less than 3 hours, everything would change, from the passengers to the crew to national policy. Watch this story and see why one seemingly harmless sentence triggered a media earthquake, broke a woman's spirit, and yet led her to rise and transform the entire airline industry. At a glance, Dr. Amani Keller looked like she just stepped off the cover of a magazine for accomplished professionals. Composed, elegant, and behind her eyes, a sharp intellect always in motion. Nearing 40, tall, poised, Amani moved with a grace that only those who have lived with pain could truly recognize. Her deep brown skin, even under the harsh white lights of LAX International Airport, radiated calm and the quiet resilience of someone long accustomed to fighting battles in silence. Her hair was twisted into soft coils, with a few early grays that owed more to sleepless nights than age. She wore a pale gray blouse under a tailored navy suit, the cuffs gently brushing her wrists. Slung over one shoulder was a dark leather bag, not new but neat, clean, the kind one carries to get things done, not to show off. The only thing that made people glance twice was the sleek black carbon cane in her right hand. Not the obvious medical kind. This was minimalist, modern, unassuming, yet clearly essential. Amani had nothing to prove to anyone, especially not today. The flight from Los Angeles to Chicago wasn't just another work trip. It was a milestone. The culmination of 10 years of medical research, long nights in the lab, missed grants, midnight phone calls from colleagues, and hundreds of hours spent poring over obscure scientific journals no one else bothered to read. Her work on neuropsychiatric lupus, a rare variant of the autoimmune disease that targets the central nervous system, had just been awarded the Adler Prize for Medical Innovation. The ceremony would be held at the National Academy of Health Conference in Chicago, and Amani was the keynote speaker. She should have felt proud, but all she felt right now was tension. Living with a chronic illness isn't like in the movies. There are no violins, no poetic lighting. It's like walking a tightrope in the dark. Every step could be the one that sends you plummeting. The neuropsychiatric lupus she had affected her nervous system, impairing memory, motor control, making her joints unstable, her muscles ache. On good days, the pain was like a low hum under her skin. On bad days, it was fire in every tendon. This morning was somewhere in between. Her left shoulder ached, her fingers were stiff, but nothing alarming. What worried her more was the slow, creeping fatigue, a storm biding its time. That's why her husband, Malik, had insisted on booking her a first-class seat and wouldn't take no for an answer. No negotiations, he'd said that morning, adjusting the small amethyst pendant around her neck. You're going to receive an award, not run a marathon before stepping on stage. She had smiled, kissed him on the cheek, and whispered thank you like a sacred ritual. Malik Keller was not just her husband, he was her refuge. A tech engineer turned startup billionaire, now the CEO and majority stakeholder of Horizon Air, one of the fastest growing airlines in the U.S. He was known for his sharp mind, strategic vision, and ruthless acquisitions. But with her, he was always gentle, present, a silent shield. He couldn't come with her today. A major acquisition in Europe had forced him to stay behind in Chicago for early morning meetings. She promised to text him before takeoff. He promised to watch her entire keynote live. That was the deal. Amani moved slowly through the terminal. She had arrived earlier than usual, avoiding any rush. She passed through TSA using her pre-check status. As always, eyes drifted toward her cane. The security officer was polite, though visibly surprised when she presented her medical documentation. People didn't expect someone like her, tall, well-dressed, with refined glasses, to be sick. Her gate, C12, was at the far end. She rode the escalator, passing hurried travelers, the sound of rolling suitcases clicking across the floor. The air was filled with coffee, loudspeakers, and crying children. When she reached the gate, the screen read, Horizon Air 1765 to Chicago, on time. A small wave of relief passed through her. She picked a seat near the boarding gate, sat down carefully, and rested the cane across her lap. Her fingertips trembled from the strain. She pulled out a thermos of ginger tea she'd brought from home and took a sip. Her legs were beginning to numb, the ache creeping into her hips, climbing toward her shoulders. She had to conserve her strength. From where she sat, she could see the boarding desk ahead, where two attendants were preparing. One was a young man, maybe in his 20s, with a gentle demeanor. His name tag read, Ryan Chang. The other, a middle-aged white woman with tightly curled hair, styled like something from a past decade, had a stern face, a sharp nose, and scanning eyes that seemed trained to catch mistakes. Her name tag read, Cynthia Greer, lead flight attendant. Cynthia was instructing Ryan to adjust the barrier ropes, her voice curt and careless of who was listening. She rifled through drawers, skimmed the passenger manifest, then glanced around like a tense manager on edge for a slip-up. Amani turned back to her tea, inhaling deeply. This wasn't her first encounter with that type of energy. She was used to skepticism. She wasn't one to demand special treatment, but she couldn't deny the discomfort Cynthia's presence stirred in her. As boarding time neared, she stood slowly, adjusted her wrist, and made her way to the desk. Ryan looked up first. Hi there, Amani said gently. I have a medical condition and need to pre-board. I have documentation if needed. Ryan smiled kindly. Of course. We'll begin pre-boarding for passengers needing assistance in just a few minutes. I'll make sure to look out for you. Thank you, she replied and began to turn back to her seat. But Cynthia's voice cut in, sharp as a blade. What kind of medical condition? It wasn't a question. It was an interrogation. Amani turned back, composed. I have neuropsychiatric lupus. It affects my motor nerves and joints. Cynthia looked her up and down. Hair, outfit, cane. Her lips curled with a hint of sarcasm. Lupus. Yes, this cane helps me keep balance. My joints can dislocate if I stand too long or get jostled during boarding. Cynthia nodded, expression flat. All right. Like Ryan said, we'll call for boarding. Be ready. Her tone was a command. Amani said nothing else. She turned, gripping her cane a little tighter. She sat down, gazing up at the ceiling. She knew this routine. She knew how to behave properly. Don't get angry. Don't overreact. Don't seem demanding. The gate was now packed, bags bumping, children screaming, announcements echoing. Amid the chaos, Amani sat, silent, composed, and no one had any idea what she was fighting. As the loudspeaker announced that boarding procedures were about to begin, Amani Keller slowly stood up. She had timed it carefully, waiting for just the right moment, not too early to have to explain herself again and again, but not too late to be caught in a crowded rush. Every time she approached the boarding gate with a cane in hand, she had to remind herself, be polite, be firm, remember you have the right. But sometimes that wasn't enough. And today, from the glance Cynthia Greer gave her earlier, Amani had a sense that something unwelcome was coming. She walked slowly toward the counter, the carbon cane tapping rhythmically against the floor, subtle but impossible to ignore. She stopped in front of Ryan Chang, the young agent who had smiled at her earlier, and handed over her boarding pass along with a set of medical documents enclosed in a transparent plastic sleeve. Hello again, Amani said calmly. As I mentioned earlier, I'll need pre-boarding due to neuropsychiatric lupus. This is a letter of verification from my specialist. Ryan bowed his head courteously and reached out to take the documents, but Cynthia Greer stepped in from the side, slicing into the exchange with her trademark iciness. You said you're sick, Cynthia asked, her eyes gliding from the cane to Amani's face with a scrutiny that felt clinical, almost accusatory. Yes, I have a neuroautoimmune condition, neuropsychiatric lupus, that affects my mobility and joint stability. Amani replied, her voice steady, clinical, like a scientist presenting research findings. Cynthia crossed her arms and scanned Amani from head to toe again. You seem to be walking just fine. Doesn't really look like you need any special boarding privileges. She didn't speak loudly, but loud enough for nearby passengers to turn their heads. A woman in the opposite row furrowed her brows. An elderly man adjusted his glasses to get a better look. Amani could feel the air shift, like a shadow had just fallen over what had been a normal, peaceful scene. I use the cane to reduce pressure on my joints. My mobility fluctuates throughout the day, and being forced to stand in a crowd or being jostled can cause dislocation, especially in my shoulders and knees, Amani explained, succinctly and clearly, each word carrying the weight of medical certainty. But you didn't request a wheelchair or any special services from the airline, Cynthia continued, her tone veering into provocation. I don't need a wheelchair, Amani replied. I'm only requesting the pre-boarding rights I'm legally entitled to under the Air Carrier Access Act. Ryan tried to interject, but Cynthia raised her hand to stop him. I'm the lead flight attendant on this flight. I have final responsibility for the crew and boarding decisions. Then she placed her hand over the scanner, blocking Ryan from scanning Amani's ticket. We only pre-board passengers who've requested special assistance in advance or show a clear need. Otherwise, you'll wait your turn like everyone else, she said, eyes cold and unwavering. Amani felt her throat tighten, not out of fear, but from the rising shame that surged like an undercurrent. Still, she remained composed. I have a letter from my neurologist at UCLA. I don't need to prove anything beyond that, she said, keeping the document packet open. Letters can be printed from anywhere, Cynthia shrugged. We're not obligated to trust every piece of paper a passenger hands us. A soft click from a phone camera sounded to Amani's left. She shifted her eyes and spotted a brown-skinned woman in a cream blazer and pencil skirt, holding her phone slightly tilted, as if checking her email. But the camera lens was pointed just enough to the side to suggest otherwise. Amani recognized it instantly. The woman was recording. Excuse me, the woman said softly, not intruding but making sure Amani could hear. My name is Jenna Reyes. I'm recording this because I think you might need documentation. I'm an attorney. Amani gave a small nod, saying nothing, her chest tightening, not from fear but from a familiarity that was bone deep. This wasn't new. Cynthia's every move, every phrase, was something Amani had internalized long ago. You trying to use a business outfit and a fancy cane to skip ahead in the line? Cynthia asked, half smiling, half mocking. If everyone did that, we wouldn't have procedures at all. Amani didn't reply. She didn't need to argue with stubbornness. But with every passing second, more eyes turned toward her. Every breath Cynthia took felt like another slice at Amani's dignity. Ryan tried once more to step in. Cynthia, maybe we should... She'll board with her group. That's final. Cynthia cut him off, nudging Ryan aside and turning to the next passenger. Amani tightened her grip on the strap of her bag, her hand trembling slightly. She turned back, her cane tapping the floor in steady beats. But this time, the sound wasn't the rhythm of her stride. It was the rhythm of being humiliated. She returned to her seat, aware of every pair of eyes still on her. Some looked annoyed. Some looked at her as if she'd just been caught trying to cheat the system. And in the corner, Jenna Reyes kept filming, her face solemn like a courtroom observer, gathering evidence for a trial she already knew was inevitable. Amani sat down slowly, placing the cane back across her lap. Her muscles were tense, but she forced herself to relax her jaw, her shoulders. The ache in her legs had returned, now amplified by emotional exhaustion. She stared ahead, not blinking, letting the familiar numbness settle in. She didn't want to cry, not because she was too proud, but because crying would only validate what Cynthia believed about her, that she was overreacting, hysterical, difficult. Jenna quietly made her way over and took the seat beside her. She kept her voice low. You don't have to talk, but I just want you to know. What just happened is not okay. I know, Amani said just above a whisper. I've seen this before. Too many times. Sometimes I film, sometimes I step in. I try to read the moment. You handled that with more grace than most. Amani gave a tired smile. I've had practice. Jenna nodded slowly. I figured. Look, if this escalates, or even if it doesn't, I'll send you this video, just in case. My email's on my firm's site, Reyes Civil Rights Law, downtown LA. You don't have to use it, but you can. Thank you, Amani said, the sincerity in her voice undeniable. Really? There was a long pause between them. The boarding announcement had started, and the line was moving forward. Families first, people with wheelchairs, uniformed military members, then business class, then first class. Amani's seat was in 1D aisle, first row. Ironically, she would have been among the first even without pre-boarding. But that wasn't the point. The point was the principle, that she had to defend her illness, justify her presence, prove her need, and still be denied, belittled, erased. As the group numbers were called, Cynthia moved like a conductor at the head of an orchestra, commanding attention and compliance. Her eyes occasionally flicked toward Amani, but never with remorse, only watchfulness, control. Jenna leaned slightly forward and whispered, "By the way, I recognized you. Dr. Keller, right? The neuro-lupus research? You're the keynote tomorrow." Amani turned, surprised. "Yes. How did you—" "I read your paper. My sister has lupus. Different type, but I follow the research." Amani's shoulders relaxed for the first time in nearly an hour. "Thank you," she said again. But this time the words weren't about the video or the legal help. They were about being seen. Eventually her group was called. Amani stood, straightened her jacket, adjusted the cane in her right hand, and walked toward the gate without hesitation. Cynthia didn't look at her. Ryan did, and offered a nod. Jenna stayed in her seat, still recording, a silent witness in a moment that didn't seem big to most people in the terminal, but would ripple far beyond gate C12 before long. And behind Amani, for the first time that morning, no one doubted that something real had just happened. Amani Keller sat silently in her seat near the boarding area, her cane resting across her lap, her eyes fixed ahead, but her mind reeling with a low, relentless churn. The ache in her shoulder had sharpened, as if every cell around the joint were quietly crying out, not from physical exertion, but from humiliation. She could feel the stares hadn't left her since the last confrontation, as if Cynthia's seed of suspicion had taken root in the collective consciousness. She was a well-dressed black woman in a tailored suit, walking upright with a sleek cane, an image that clashed too sharply with the stereotype of someone who needed help. She knew it, and Cynthia was clearly exploiting it. Just minutes later, the announcement came over the speaker. "Passengers needing additional boarding time or special assistance, please make your way to the gate." That was her cue. Amani took a deep breath, stood slowly, checked her cane, retrieved her medical file from her bag, and walked toward the gate where Ryan and Cynthia were stationed. But this time, Cynthia didn't let things unfold the way they had before. As Amani approached, Cynthia stepped fully in front of Ryan, her hand firmly on the boarding pass scanner, blocking access like a gatekeeper. "You've been sitting still for 20 minutes, and now you say you need assistance?" Cynthia said, louder than necessary, loud enough for the Zone 1 passengers behind her to hear. Several heads turned. The atmosphere thickened, as if the air itself had paused. Amani kept her voice calm. "I've explained my condition and provided documentation. Sitting quietly doesn't mean I'm not in pain. In fact, extended sitting increases the risk of joint dislocation for me." But Cynthia didn't move. She crossed her arms, her eyes brimming with skepticism, as though she were facing a con artist. "I've seen plenty like you," Cynthia said, her voice tinged with mockery, "trying to board early to snag overhead bin space. You know, there isn't enough for everyone." A few subtle nods followed from behind. Someone chuckled under their breath. Amani felt every one of those moments like tiny thorns pressing into her back. "This is a letter from my specialist at UCLA, Amani said, opening the folder. "He's the neurologist overseeing my care." But Cynthia merely glanced at it and spoke as if spitting out something dirty. "Anyone can print a piece of paper." That line wasn't just a medical insult. It was an attack on Amani's integrity, on the professional honesty she'd upheld her entire career in science. Not far away, Jenna Reyes, the woman in the cream blazer, was ready. Her phone was already recording, the lens quietly capturing the moment when Cynthia leaned in toward Amani and said in a near whisper, laced with venom, "It's disgusting to fake an illness just to get special treatment." The final word landed like a slap across the tension in the air. A few people looked at each other, some squinting as if to confirm what they just heard. Amani stood tall, her hand tightening around the cane. "I'm not faking anything. I'm doing my best to live responsibly with my condition, to stay out of anyone's way, and to simply ask for the basic rights I'm entitled to," she said, her voice no longer soft, but cold and clear, like a blade slicing through fog. But Cynthia didn't back down, didn't show remorse. "If you really needed help, why didn't you request a wheelchair from the start?" Cynthia shot back. "You're not listed under special assistance, and I have the full authority to deny pre-boarding if I find insufficient grounds." Without another word, Cynthia nodded at Ryan to continue boarding Zone 1 passengers, entirely ignoring the fact that Amani still stood there, holding her open file. Amani did not cry, not a single tear, but her entire body slipped into a state of paralysis, similar to the way her nervous system would flare when inflamed, rendering every signal from her body useless. She stepped back, not hastily, but deliberately, then turned and walked back to her original seat. Each step felt like another thorn embedding itself into her chest. She didn't sit immediately. She stood still, watching the flow of passengers boarding the plane. People who either didn't notice or didn't care about what had just happened. Maybe they thought she was faking. Maybe they believed Cynthia was just following protocol. Maybe they didn't think anything at all. And it was that apathy that made everything worse. Jenna Reyes put her phone away, her gaze sharp as a razor. She didn't need to check the screen to know she had captured every word of the exchange. Jenna wasn't the kind of person to interfere without cause. But what she had just witnessed, the calculated coldness, the verbal aggression wrapped in uniform and title, was no longer an internal airline matter. It was a public act of systemic humiliation. And Jenna, as a civil rights attorney, knew exactly what to do with that footage. Amani, now seated again, clutched her cane as if it were the last thread keeping her from breaking apart. The pain she felt wasn't in her joints anymore. It was deeper, somewhere no MRI could ever detect. And what hurt the most wasn't the insult. It was the terrifying familiarity of the entire moment. She had lived this before, and she knew with haunting certainty that it wasn't over yet. The first-class cabin of Horizon Air was always advertised as a quiet, luxurious, and personalized experience. But for Amani Keller, in this moment, it felt more like a beautifully decorated holding cell for everything that was steadily going wrong. She stepped onto the plane with an unstable heartbeat, not from anxiety, but from the accumulated tension of the humiliating confrontation back at the gate. Cynthia Greer, the woman who had just denied her boarding as if she were unworthy, now stood at the front of the first-class section, adjusting her neck scarf with practiced grace and offering a model smile to the white couple ahead. The moment Cynthia's gaze landed on Amani, the smile vanished as if it had never existed, replaced by an expression of detached indifference. Amani moved slowly, using her cane to stay balanced, each step cautious on the narrow plane aisle. Her seat was 2B, aisle seat, left side of the cabin. She had just lifted her small handbag toward the overhead bin when from behind, a middle-aged man with a massive backpack surged forward, as if racing against time. The collision with her left shoulder was sharper than she anticipated. For a second, she felt the joint slip. An unmistakable pop rang in her mind like a siren. She nearly collapsed, saved only by the cane. Pain. Not the usual dull, bearable kind, but sharp like a blade, stabbing through her muscle in waves of hundreds of tiny needles. Amani gripped the back of the seat in front of her, eyes clenched tight, breath shortened, and with the reflex and training she had developed over the years, she shifted the shoulder back into approximate alignment. Not perfect, not correct, but passable. Her face turned pale, sweat beginning to bead at her brow, despite the cool cabin air. The man didn't look back. He didn't apologize. He kept walking down the aisle as if nothing had happened. Amani lowered herself into her seat, adjusted her neck pillow, and reached over with her right hand to gently massage her left bicep as a way to calm herself. She needed her medication, but taking it too early would make her drowsy, and she needed to remain alert in case anything else went wrong. She decided to wait. Cynthia walked down the aisle without acknowledging her, stopping instead beside the man in seat 2A. "Would you prefer still water or white wine, sir?" The man, a well-dressed older gentleman who looked like a doctor, nodded and asked for water. Cynthia smiled, noted it on her tablet, then crossed the aisle and spoke softly to the woman in 2C. But as she passed seat 2B, where Amani sat, she said nothing. Didn't ask, didn't look, didn't serve. It was as if the seat was empty. Amani swallowed hard. She recognized this behavior. She'd seen it before. It didn't require an outright slur to humiliate someone. Intentional silence, calculated disregard, and selective kindness were the most insidious forms of social violence. A few minutes later, Cynthia returned with the pre-departure drink tray. She stopped at 2A, handed the man his lemon water with her professional smile, then walked right past Amani without even pausing. When she reached 2C, she politely offered wine and greeted her by name. "Ms. Park, so lovely to serve you today." A chill ran down Amani's spine, not just from the tightening in her left shoulder, but from the realization that she was being slowly eroded by a silent war being waged across two layers of civility, one offered to others, and one entirely withheld from her. The aircraft rolled away from the gate, preparing for takeoff. Cynthia stood at the front of the cabin, checking seatbelts one last time. As she walked past Amani again, she cast a quick glance, not to check on her well-being, but simply to verify she was still there. She didn't say a word. Amani turned her face toward the window and took a long breath. She needed to stay grounded. She needed to make it through this flight. She needed to reach Chicago, walk onto that stage, deliver her speech, receive her award, and get back home. But right now, this aircraft, still on the ground, had become a test of her emotional endurance. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, Cynthia began the dinner service. The aroma of roasted chicken and buttered rolls floated gently through the cabin. The man in seat 2A lowered his tray table, chatting amiably with Cynthia. When it came time to serve Amani, Cynthia walked right past her without a glance, without asking if she wanted a meal. No menu, no water, no eye contact. Amani stayed silent. She didn't need further proof to know what was happening. Her left shoulder was too stiff to reach up and press the attendant button without excruciating pain. And she wasn't about to give Cynthia another opening to humiliate her. Not long after, Cynthia returned with the trash bag. She moved row by row, collecting cups and napkins from passengers with gentle words. At row 2, she stopped at 2A, took his glass, exchanged a polite, "Thank you," then stepped past Amani, pausing just slightly, then leaned down, tilted her head, and said in a low, venomous whisper, just loud enough for Amani and the man in 2A to hear, "So what do you need now? Another fake pillow for your fake pain?" Amani didn't respond. Her hand clenched the armrest, knuckles whitening. She didn't flinch, didn't look at Cynthia, didn't beg. She sat perfectly still, like stone, gripping onto the last fibers of her dignity. The man in 2A turned slightly, frowning, as if he had just heard something he wasn't supposed to. But he said nothing. He simply shifted away from her, silent, like everyone else. Amani stayed frozen in place. She could feel the sting, not just in her shoulder, but in the deeper place that pain couldn't reach, the place reserved for betrayal, for cruelty dressed in procedure. Her body was screaming for rest, for peace, for mercy, but she would not surrender. Not here, not now. She looked forward, past Cynthia, past the tray, past the illusion of comfort in class. And she wondered, not for the first time, if survival meant swallowing every insult until nothing was left inside. Amani Keller sat still in seat 2B, her gaze fixed on the window, though her focus had long faded. The pain in her left shoulder had intensified, sending subtle tremors down to her elbow. She had held her composure from the boarding gate to the first-class cabin, but now she felt her body betraying her with every second. She forced herself to regulate her breathing, tried to center her attention on her heartbeat, on the aircraft's steady hum, on the rhythmic drone of the engines like a manufactured lullaby. She hadn't eaten dinner because Cynthia had deliberately ignored her. She hadn't taken her medication for fear it would make her too drowsy to defend herself if something happened. And now it was all crashing back at her, mercilessly. She needed to go to the restroom, not for a simple need. The dizziness was creeping in by waves. She needed water. She needed to stand up and shift her posture before her nervous system entered full dysregulation. Amani knew the signs. First, the tightening around the neck, then the ears start to ring, then the body goes cold while sweat breaks along the back. If not managed in time, her blood pressure would plummet and she would faint. And once the body enters that chain reaction, there's no pulling it back. She pressed the call button. The small light above her seat turned on. Cynthia Greer was at the front of the cabin, chatting with the attendant from economy class. When she saw the light at 2B, she turned, spotted Amani slowly moving, gripping the armrest to stand. Cynthia marched toward her, the performative smile vanishing from her face. "What do you think you're doing?" Cynthia's voice came cold and blunt. "I need to use the restroom," Amani replied, her left hand lightly holding her throbbing shoulder, her right gripping the cane. "Oh, pressing buttons again just to pretend?" Cynthia said louder, her eyes sweeping across the cabin as if inviting witnesses to a staged act. Amani didn't argue. She simply repeated, "I need to use the restroom." "Turbulence is coming. Seatbelt light is on. You need to sit back down," Cynthia said, not as a warning, but as an order. She stood in front of the restroom door like a guard. Amani glanced at the seatbelt sign. Yes, it was lit, but the plane was perfectly stable. No shaking, no announcements from the cockpit. On long-haul flights, the sign sometimes stayed on as a precaution. In emergencies like hers, flight attendants had discretion to allow movement. Cynthia was clearly using the situation as leverage to exert control. "I'm not well," Amani said, her voice weakening. "I need to go. Now." "Did you not hear me?" Cynthia pressed, still blocking the path between Amani and the toilet door. "You should sit back down and stop making a scene." A wave of lightheadedness hit Amani like surf crashing onto rocks. She grabbed the edge of the nearby seat to steady herself. Everything started to blur. The sounds around her faded, as if she were sinking down a deep, dark well. She tried to speak, but her lips couldn't form the words. A cold sweat dripped down her spine, and then everything went black. She collapsed to the floor of the forward cabin, her head nearly hitting the corner of a passenger seat. Her body went limp like a soaked cloth wrung dry. For a moment, Cynthia stepped back, a flash of panic flickering in her eyes. But only for a second. She quickly forced her tone back into shape. "Oh, come on, really?" Cynthia muttered loudly enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "This is quite the performance." But this time, no one laughed. No one agreed. The atmosphere in the cabin stiffened like ice. A woman in row 3 stood up immediately. The man in 2A leaned forward, checking Amani's breathing. And from seat 1C, Jenna Reyes didn't hesitate. She rose to her feet, phone still recording, and strode toward Amani. "I'm an attorney," Jenna announced loudly. "Is there a doctor on board?" A man of Asian descent in row 4 stood at once, a medical bracelet visible on his wrist. "I'm an internist. Dr. Levi Kim. Let me through." Cynthia stepped aside like she'd been shoved by invisible force. Jenna kept filming, her eyes locked on the lead flight attendant with a silent message that couldn't be mistaken. "I'm recording everything." Dr. Kim knelt beside Amani, checking her pulse, her breath, her neurological response. "She's in a severe hypotensive episode, signs of neurocardiogenic syncope. We need to elevate her legs and clear her airway." Jenna removed her scarf and rolled it into a makeshift pillow to prop up Amani's legs. A younger flight attendant from economy rushed over with blankets and cushions. Cynthia stood frozen, lips pressed together, hands clenched in front of her as if trying to conceal a tremble. The rest of the cabin had fallen utterly silent. The same people who had turned away before now watched every move intently. Amani was still unconscious, her forehead damp with sweat, her lips pale from lack of oxygen. In the minutes that followed, the forward cabin of the aircraft turned into a makeshift emergency ward at 35,000 feet. Dr. Kim called for a mixture of warm water and sugar to make an oral rehydration solution. He checked Amani's pulse again after 5 minutes and requested that the flight crew notify the cockpit to arrange medical support upon landing. Cynthia bit her lip. Her eyes flickered as if she just realized something had slipped completely out of her control. But Jenna never looked away from her phone. Her camera was still rolling, capturing everything. Amani's collapse, Cynthia's initial indifference, the sneering comment. "Quite the performance, huh?" And now the flurry of people scrambling to save the very woman who, just minutes ago, had been treated like a liar. Jenna took a breath, watching the scene unfold with a steadiness only years of courtroom battles could teach. She didn't need to say a word. The evidence was speaking louder than outrage ever could. Cynthia, who had stood tall and untouchable for most of the flight, now looked pale beneath the cabin lights, her polished exterior cracking as whispers began to circulate among passengers. Amani remained motionless, her body recovering in stages, but not yet regaining full awareness. Her cane lay beside her on the carpet, a symbol of the truth no one had believed until it was almost too late. The irony was brutal and absolute. Row by row, the cabin watched, silent, solemn, some ashamed. The man in 2A sat still, his hand folded tightly as if in penance. The woman from row 3 who had stood first now stayed near, offering a bottle of water she'd taken from her own bag. Even the passengers in the back rows were craning their necks, trying to see the woman they had all ignored when it would have mattered most. Jenna stepped to the side, no longer recording, but still holding the phone in her hand, like a sealed affidavit. She looked down at Cynthia and spoke just loud enough for her to hear. This wasn't just neglect. This was targeted humiliation. You made her a spectacle, and now the world's going to see it. Cynthia said nothing. She didn't protest. She didn't apologize. She simply stood there, arms stiff, eyes darting around like a caged bird, realizing the glass walls were now clear to everyone. And in the middle of that luxurious first-class cabin, designed to convey power, prestige, and perfection, a truth had revealed itself too raw to ignore. A black woman with a real illness and a real need had been mocked, disbelieved, denied, and brought to the edge of collapse not by her condition, but by the coldness of someone who saw her as less. The aircraft, meant to be a symbol of upward mobility, had instead become a chamber of quiet cruelty. And it was only when Amani's body could no longer hold the burden that the mask finally cracked. Not just for Cynthia, but for everyone watching. On the cabin floor, under the sterile light spilling from the overhead panel, Amani Keller struggled to open her eyes. Every sound around her was warped. The engine's drone echoed as if from the bottom of the ocean. Dr. Kim's face blurred like a shadow moving in and out of focus. Her head throbbed. She knew she couldn't stand. Not yet. Her body was screaming, but her mind wasn't on how long she might be unconscious or whether they would initiate an emergency landing. Her only thought was that she needed to reach out. Immediately. Her trembling hand brushed across her phone inside the thin robe pocket. She barely had enough strength to tap the screen. Her voice cracked, just a whisper. "Call Malik," she said, unsure if Siri could even register her words. But a faint glow came to life on the screen, like a miracle. The interface opened. Malik Keller's contact appeared, his photo smiling in a dark suit at the ribbon cutting of Atlantic Terminal, and the ringing began. In the headquarters of Horizon Air, a 44-story glass tower just off Lake Michigan, the conference room on the 42nd floor currently held some of the biggest names in aviation and flight tech investment. Malik Keller, the CEO of Horizon Air, sat at the center table, hands resting on a tablet, eyes locked on the quarterly growth chart. He was presenting to the extended board and investors from Sovereign Asia Fund, who were considering a $500 million infusion to expand the company's hybrid hub infrastructure. So if we deploy automated passenger routing at gates A through D, like the Munich model, we can cut 18 minutes off average boarding time per flight and improve passenger experience by 36%, Malik said with calm authority, each word calculated, every number sharp. But just as he moved to the next slide, the phone beside him vibrated softly. The device was set to silent. Only one contact had override privileges. Amani Dot. Malik never interrupted a pitch, not once in 20 years. But this time, he froze mid-sentence. His eyes flicked to the screen. Something inside him knew instantly. This wasn't a routine call. He picked up the phone, stood, and addressed the room. "Pardon me one moment. It's my wife." He stepped out of the conference room. As the door closed behind him, Malik pressed the phone to his ear. "Amani? Honey, what's going on?" The voice on the other end was faint, just shallow breathing. Then her voice came through, weak, cracking, fractured, but unmistakably a call from the edge of despair. "It happened again," Amani whispered. "This time, on your airline." Malik's heart stopped. "Where are you? What flight?" His tone dropped low. sharp, stripped of hesitation. He had trained for crisis scenarios. But this was different. This was his wife, on his aircraft, and she had just collapsed. Flight 602, LAX to ORD. I, I'm sorry. Then silence. Malik didn't wait. He dialed an internal number. Jody, I need Vice President of Operations, Head of Aviation Logistics, Director of Customer Protection, and Crisis Response in Emergency Room Alpha. 4 minutes. Move. When he returned to the conference room, the investors were still seated, waiting for him to continue. Malik walked to the table, closed his laptop, and spoke with finality. Apologies, everyone. This meeting is suspended. Horizon Air is entering emergency response protocol. Less than 60 seconds later, the lights on the 38th floor, the location of emergency coordination, flickered on. Malik arrived flanked by the Director of Security, the Vice President of Technical Operations, and the full crisis management unit. On the main screen, a digital map tracked Flight 602. A blue dot hovered approximately 27 minutes from final descent into Chicago O'Hare. The live system feed showed no formal medical alert from the cockpit. But Malik didn't need data. He had a call from Amani, and that was enough. We need 5 actions now, Malik said, voice calm but every word an unshakable command. 1. Reroute Flight 602 upon landing. Do not send it to a commercial gate. Redirect it to Hangar 7A. 2. Initiate direct comm with the cockpit and request a report on the medical condition of the female passenger in seat 2B. 3. Deploy a Horizon medical helicopter from Midway to standby on runway 3. 4. Assemble a medical ground crew at the private stair access. 5. Elevate security to level 2. Flag all video and audio records from the first-class cabin and crew. The Vice President of Operations nodded, already issuing orders to the Air Traffic Coordination Unit. We'll move the plane to a private hangar. No press, no public feed, no camera access at the gate. Malik turned to Jody, his personal assistant. I want the full passenger manifest from 602. Get me the flight lead attendant's profile, and find out if anyone on board is recording. Jody nodded. There's a passenger named Jenna Reyes. She's posted an Instagram story. We believe she's filming the cabin. We'll contact her. Malik paused, then nodded. Reach out to her the moment they land. Let her know the CEO wants to meet, personally. While the system shifted like a well-oiled engine into rapid response, a part of Malik remained still, shaken. Amani. She never complained, never asked for much. And today she had to call from the cabin floor, after collapsing, just to say, it happened again. And Malik knew. What she meant wasn't just the flare-up of her lupus. She meant the look, the suspicion, the weight of a prejudice embedded in the gaze of someone who was supposed to serve with compassion. And that was unforgivable. Horizon Air Flight 602, a Boeing 737, dipped slightly one final time before descending onto runway 3R at O'Hare International Airport. The sky over Chicago was gray and misty, with runway lights flashing coldly through the winter haze. But instead of turning right toward the commercial terminal, the pilot received direct instructions from the tower. Reroute to the taxiway leading to private hangar 7A, a space normally reserved for executive aircraft and high-security VIP protocols. Cynthia Greer, the first-class lead attendant, furrowed her brow as the captain announced over the intercom that the plane would be stopping in a restricted area due to a combination of technical and medical reasons. She assumed this was a precaution in response to the earlier incident involving the woman in seat 2B, the black passenger she had doubted from the very beginning. Cynthia exhaled sharply. Deep down, she still believed the woman had exaggerated her condition. Collapsed from lupus? Sat through the whole flight fine? Then just happens to faint right before the lavatory? At the most convenient time? She thought. Outwardly, she remained composed. I'll handle it once medics arrive, she said to a fellow attendant as she prepped for landing. In the business class cabin, Amani Keller remained lying on her side, her head gently resting against the seat, her arm temporarily immobilized with a cold towel to stabilize her shoulder. Dr. Levi Kim, who had assisted her during her collapse, sat beside her, eyes fixed on her pulse and breathing. You're stable, but don't try to talk. Just focus on breathing, he said softly. Amani nodded weakly, her eyes still closed. As the plane came to a halt, no passenger bridge approached. Instead, a sleek silver boarding stair, usually reserved for VIPs, was secured to the aircraft. Next to it, a Horizon Air medical helicopter with a bold golden wing logo hovered quietly. Two black SUVs with special license plates were parked nearby, and at least 6 security officers stood positioned evenly across the tarmac. From the cockpit, an internal crew message came on. Main door opening in 60 seconds. Ground response team has reached the aircraft. Prepare to coordinate. Inside the cabin, Cynthia felt a chill run up her spine. What is this? Who called in the VIP team? She whispered to the assistant flight attendant. The woman shrugged. You know more than I do. The aircraft door swung open. A rush of freezing air swept through, and the first person to board wasn't a paramedic, wasn't a flight supervisor, and certainly wasn't an airport executive. It was a tall man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, white shirt without a wrinkle, and a pale lavender tie. He walked with intent, his face unreadable, but his gaze sharp enough to cut through the pressurized cabin air. On his hand gleamed a platinum wedding band. An old-style Omega watch clasped his wrist. His face was unmistakable, and in that moment one of the attendants gasped aloud. Oh my God! Malik Keller needed no introduction. The entire cabin froze. Cynthia's mouth fell open. Her pulse skyrocketed. She instinctively stepped back, then tried to compose herself. He couldn't possibly be here. The CEO of the airline? Personally boarding the plane? Over this? Malik didn't look at anyone except Amani. He walked straight past the stunned passengers. Dr. Kim stood and stepped aside immediately once he recognized who was approaching. You're here, Amani whispered as her eyes barely opened. Malik knelt beside his wife, placed his hand over hers, his eyes filled with worry and rage just barely contained. I'm here. You don't need to say a word. I know, he said, his voice soft, as though calming the very air in the cabin. Amani gently shook her head. She whispered, She still doesn't believe me. Malik nodded. I know. Then for the first time since stepping onto the aircraft, he turned around. The motion alone made Cynthia stiffen. Malik stood, his eyes locked onto her, not with fury, not with yelling, but with a gaze that made people instinctively lower their heads. You're Cynthia Greer? He asked, voice calm and deep, every syllable slicing with precision. Cynthia nodded automatically. Yes, You're the lead flight attendant on this flight? He continued without pause. Yes. I was just following protocol. Malik didn't respond immediately. He walked over to the galley, the prep station near the crew service area. He rested his hand on the edge of the counter, then turned around. This time he wasn't just speaking to her, but to everyone in the cabin. What procedure allows you to deny medical support to a passenger with legally verified documentation? He asked. The tone wasn't loud, but every word felt heavy. Cynthia said nothing. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. What protocol gives a Horizon Air employee, the airline I built, the authority to humiliate a chronically ill woman because she didn't look like someone who needed help? He continued, his voice beginning to tremble. Not from weakness, but from restrained conviction. A passenger whispered audibly, Dear God. Malik drew a long breath. Then he said with clarity that pierced the silence, I'm Malik Keller. I founded this airline with one principle. No one, he paused, no one is judged by how they appear. He stepped closer to Cynthia, just enough for her to have to lift her gaze. And then, with no theatrics, with no anger, just pure frozen resolve, he said, And today, you violated that principle. On a flight that bears my name, against a woman who bears my name. Malik Keller stood before Cynthia Greer like a living wall of truth newly unveiled. Not a sound stirred in the cabin. Every passenger's eyes were locked on the man in the tailored suit, walking slowly but with the weight of finality. Each step a quiet end to something that had already gone too far. Cynthia stepped back half a pace, her face pale, one hand gripping the nearest seat for balance. But there was nothing that could hold her steady for what was about to come. Malik didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke, with a tone loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, loud enough for the ground supervisor waiting below to catch every word through the headset. "I'm the man who signs your paycheck." He let that sentence float for a beat, a formal declaration of identity, then continued, slowly, firmly. "And you laid hands on my wife. You humiliated a sick woman." A passenger somewhere in the back whispered to the person beside them, "She's done." But no one laughed, no one smirked. The silence in first class now wasn't born of fear. It came from the collective recognition that they were witnessing a reckoning. Real power doesn't need to yell. It only needs to arrive. Cynthia tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. I I didn't know. I didn't realize she was your wife. If I had..." Malik cut her off, not with volume, but with a stare so cold it sliced through the air. "If you had, you'd have faked kindness better. That makes it worse." He turned to the security team who had just entered from the rear door of the plane. Two officers in black uniforms, radios clipped to their collars, eyes fixed and unblinking. Malik spoke simply, no need to raise his tone. "Take her badge. Suspend her immediately. Effective now." One of the officers nodded and stepped toward Cynthia. She recoiled instinctively, eyes wide. Wait, I need to explain." Malik didn't look at her again. He bent down beside Amani, gently adjusting the edge of her coat like nothing else in the room mattered. A gesture full of tenderness, completely at odds with the heavy air behind him. And that was the real statement. He had done what needed to be done, and there was nothing more to say. The officers approached Cynthia with quiet firmness. She hesitated, then reached with trembling hands into her uniform's breast pocket and pulled out her Horizon Air badge. It read, "Cynthia L. Greer, Cabin Lead." Her hands shook so badly that she couldn't rebutton her shirt afterward. One officer scanned the badge into their internal system to revoke access, then slid it into an evidence pouch. Jenna Reyes, the first-class passenger who had recorded everything, now stepped forward and stood beside Malik. She said nothing. She simply extended a small SD card in her open palm. Malik looked at her, nodded softly, and took it without asking a single question. He didn't need to. He knew Jenna hadn't edited anything, hadn't filtered it. It was the truth, and the truth would remain. Cynthia stood frozen. The surrounding passengers neither smiled nor commented. No one comforted her. No one defended her. They sat in silence, as if they had seen enough. A woman who once represented an airline, armed only with the belief that not looking the part meant not deserving, was now being removed from the very space she once ruled. As she was escorted away, no one took photos. No one recorded. No one clapped. No one mocked her. There were only the sounds of her unsteady steps down the narrow aisle, each one a retreat toward the rear door, where just minutes earlier she had strutted with authority. She glanced back once, perhaps hoping someone might stand, might say something in her defense. But no one did. All she saw was Malik Keller, still kneeling beside his wife, gently resting his hand over Amani's, and saying in a voice only she could hear, "It's almost over. I'm here, and I won't let anyone hurt you again." The door closed behind Cynthia. Outside on the runway, the engines of the waiting medical helicopter began to spin. No one expected the video recorded by Jenna Reyes to become the spark that would ignite the collapse of an entire outdated system. Within less than 12 hours after landing, the 5-minute and 47-second clip capturing the cruel treatment of Amani Keller was uploaded to an anonymous TikTok account. At first, it garnered only a few thousand views overnight, but when a major account with nearly 2 million followers reposted it with the caption, "She asked to pre-board," the crew laughed. Now watch what happened. Everything exploded. In less than 3 hours, the video surpassed 10 million views. Morning newscasts on CBS, NBC, and CNN all opened with bold headlines. "CEO's wife denied pre-boarding, then collapsed mid-flight." The image of Amani Keller lying on the airplane floor, arms trembling, eyes shut tight, surrounded by the chilling indifference of a Horizon Air lead flight attendant, became the symbol of neglected suffering. Every frame was crystal clear. There was no room left for justification. Cynthia Greer had been suspended. But that was only the beginning. Twitter erupted with hashtags. "Invisible pain is real." Horizon Scandal, Kushar Believe Patience, Malik Keller Respond, and Justice for Amani. A flood of users began sharing similar experiences. Stories of being denied assistance because they didn't look sick, of invisible disabilities being mocked, of being pushed aside simply for appearing too healthy. A professor with multiple sclerosis shared that airline staff once refused to bring her a wheelchair because if you can walk, you don't need help. A woman with Crohn's disease wrote, I once shakily handed over a doctor's note, and the ticket agent scoffed, anyone can print a Google Doc. Amani's story is our story. And they all echoed one word. Finally, someone had enough power to say this out loud for us. Malik Keller didn't respond immediately. When reporters swarmed Horizon Air headquarters in Chicago, the glass doors remained closed, the curtains drawn. A small sign on the front door read, "We are listening." And they truly were. Within 36 hours, Malik convened the entire executive board, the legal team, the communications division, and invited 7 patient advocacy organizations to join a roundtable. But he knew that what was happening could not be solved by a sterile press release or a cold public statement. Something bigger was required, a full break from the old model, and it had to come from him, the one ultimately responsible, to say it himself. On the third day following the incident, Horizon Air held a national press conference at the Grand Pacific Convention Center in downtown Chicago. The entire city seemed to hold its breath. More than 180 reporters from domestic and international outlets were present. CNN broadcasted it live. On stage, there was only a small podium, no logos, no digital backgrounds, just Malik Keller, no tie, no makeup, stepping forward, holding a simple printed sheet. He didn't begin with his name. He began with an apology. I want to apologize to my wife, Amani Keller, who taught me that pain doesn't need to scream to be real. I apologize to the passengers on that flight, who witnessed a cruelty we had once labeled procedure. I apologize to every person living with invisible pain who has ever been doubted, diminished, or silenced, simply because they didn't have a visible wound to prove it. No one blinked, not a single murmur. The entire country was listening. Cynthia Greer has been suspended, he continued, but if we stop at a single name, then Horizon Air is no better than the institutions that sacrifice individuals to preserve broken systems. I have read every testimony, every hashtag, every tear-filled message you've shared, and I agree, it's time for an airline to carry more than people. We must carry dignity. He raised his head and looked directly into the camera lens. Today I announce, Horizon Air is officially implementing a comprehensive new policy called the Horizon Protocol. Cameras clicked furiously, but Malik didn't pause to pose. He placed the paper on the podium and read each provision with unwavering seriousness. First, every frontline employee will undergo mandatory training on invisible disabilities, led by an independent medical oversight board. Second, no employee may refuse assistance if a passenger presents valid medical documentation, regardless of whether symptoms are visible. Third, every Horizon Air flight will include at least one onboard medical support specialist trained in psychological and emergency response. Fourth, an internal review board, including physicians, legal advisors, and patient community representatives, will oversee all passenger complaints, ensuring nothing gets buried or delayed. Fifth, every new hire must sign a personal ethics pledge, the very first line of which reads, I believe that pain does not need to be visible to be valid. No one clapped, not because they weren't moved, but because they were holding back tears. A BBC reporter asked, do you believe the public will forgive you? Malik looked down for a few seconds, then responded, forgiveness is their choice. But I believe that if we make real changes, not through PR, but through action, it will come. Within 24 hours, headlines across the nation read, Horizon Air's new beginning, a patient-centered policy. Former victims of Cynthia Greer began to speak out. An elderly man recalled how she once asked him to run 3 steps to prove he needed help. A woman with autism shared how Cynthia had once shouted in her face for not responding fast enough. Now they had a voice, and now they were heard. Horizon Air became the center of media attention, but not in a negative light. A French newspaper wrote, This is the first airline bold enough to name the problem and name it correctly. An aviation industry analyst said, "This may mark the cultural turning point for the entire service sector." And in a quieter place, in the modest apartment of the couple in the suburbs of Chicago, Amani Keller watched the press conference replay on her laptop. When Malik said, "You don't have to shout to be believed. Sometimes a single glance is enough," she smiled. Her hand, once trembling with pain, now gently clicked pause. She didn't need the world to chant her name. She only needed one person, the one fighting for her, to understand. Pain is real, even when it isn't wrapped in bandages.
When Amani Keller regained consciousness in the intensive care unit, the first light she saw wasn't from the hospital ceiling. It was from a phone screen, where millions of people were sharing a video she didn't even know existed. The 3-minute, 18-second clip capturing her entire confrontation with flight attendant Cynthia Greer was now being dissected frame by major news outlets. Not because she was the CEO's wife, but because for the first time a video captured the invisibility of pain, of quiet contempt, of bias, born from those entrusted with protecting passengers. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. Amani simply stared at the screen and saw a woman struggling in silence. And in that moment, she realized she wasn't alone. There were millions of others enduring in silence, without a voice, without cameras, without a husband who happened to be CEO. Those people, that was why this pain had to be turned into something bigger. A system shouldn't only change when power intervenes. It must change because it has been wrong for far too long. As CEO of Horizon Air, Malik Keller held a national press conference. He didn't stand behind a distant podium. He stood in the middle of the room holding a microphone like a man speaking to the nation. No passenger, whether an ordinary citizen, a patient, someone with a disability, or a physician, should have to beg to be believed. No one should have to prove they deserve respect. Starting today, we are not just apologizing, we are changing. From that speech came the Horizon Protocol, a set of 12 policies, including unprecedented principles in the airline industry. Every flight attendant must undergo mandatory emotional training. The customer feedback system is redesigned to prioritize invisible illnesses, and most notably, an independent oversight board was established, composed of doctors, sociologists, and representatives from the disabled community. The complaint handling process was rewritten, not in administrative jargon, but in the language of compassion. They even changed the forms. No more cold, "I agree" checkboxes, but a question. Did we make you feel safe, heard, and respected? Other airlines, many of which had ignored warnings about implicit bias in staff training, were now forced to re-examine themselves. A wave of reform spread. The Horizon Protocol became part of the curriculum in flight academies across 22 states. The media dubbed it the wake-up slap of the service industry. But for Amani, it didn't start with a slap. It started with a look, the very first skeptical glance when she said, "I need assistance to pre-board." And Cynthia Greer? After being suspended, badge revoked, and escorted off the aircraft in front of hundreds of silent onlookers, she spiraled into panic. A week later, Cynthia's personal attorney attempted to contact the media to clarify the situation, but no outlet agreed to publish it. The evidence from the aircraft cameras, the original passenger video from Jenna, and the testimony of Dr. Levi Kim were all too clear. Cynthia lost her job, was denied re-entry into the airline industry, and gradually faded from public life. In a leaked video, Cynthia was seen leaving a suburban gas station, holding a shopping bag, eyes avoiding the camera. Some said she was pitiful, but most responded, "She should have listened the first time." To Amani, the incident could not end with one person getting fired. It only mattered if the system was healed. 3 months after the event, she officially launched the Amani Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting patients with neuropsychiatric lupus and other invisible pain syndromes. She started with 4 employees, a small office in South Loop, and a slogan on the front door: "If they don't see your pain, we do." The organization provided legal advocacy for those denied service due to non-visible health issues, connected patients with healthcare networks, hosted seminars for public-facing service agencies, and most importantly, developed the Compassion Training for Frontline Workers program, which received over 10,000 signups within 6 months. She declined talk show invitations, declined book deals, declined memoir offers. I'm not a victim, and I'm not the main character. I'm just someone who couldn't stay silent any longer. 1 year later, during the National Civil Contribution Award ceremony, Amani Keller stepped onto the stage in a room filled with silence. She didn't look for family. She didn't look for cameras. She searched only for the eyes of those who had once been afraid to speak their pain. She said briefly, "Justice should not be a privilege. Compassion should not be a choice. And respect should be the bare minimum, not a reward." The applause lasted nearly 4 minutes. The next day, in a small supermarket in Utah, an elderly woman struggled to lift a grocery bag while waiting in line. A Horizon Air employee, picking up snacks for his overnight shift, stepped in. "Let me help you, ma'am." The woman looked at him and gently said, "You work at Horizon, huh? My mother once got special assistance from your airline." The crew was kind. "Thank you." The young man simply smiled and said, "It's the least we can do." Back in Chicago in her small office, Amani sat reading the first email report from the Aviation Reform Committee, where the federal government proposed adopting the Horizon Protocol as a national model for all transportation sectors. She nodded, but what made her truly smile was a message from a 16-year-old girl with lupus. "You don't know me, but because of you I wore a short skirt for the first time in 2 years. I'm no longer ashamed of my cane." Amani looked out the window. The city was still bustling, planes still taking off, people still rushing. But somewhere, compassion had finally found a place. And she knew. That was worth more than any medal. When a reporter asked her, "If you had one sentence to sum up this entire journey, what would it be?" Amani Keller didn't hesitate. She simply said, "Compassion isn't a luxury. It's the bare minimum."
So that's it. All because of a suspicious glance, a mocking comment in an airplane cabin, a single moment of lacking compassion, and the entire airline industry was forced to take a hard look at itself. But what made it impossible for us to look away? It wasn't because Amani was the CEO's wife. It was because if someone like her, with proper documentation, a doctorate, grace, and dignity, could still be dismissed like that, how many more are suffering in silence every single day with no one to speak up for them? Do you feel the injustice? Do you feel like this should never happen? Not even once? And yet you saw there was no need for anger, no need for revenge. Just one person who stood up and said, "I won't stay silent anymore." If this story stirred something in your heart, a spark of outrage, a moment of empathy, or a quiet promise that tomorrow you'll treat someone with a little more kindness, leave a comment below. Tell us if you've ever met someone like Amani, ever been someone in a moment like this, or ever wished someone had stood up for you. And if you believe compassion isn't a luxury, but the bare minimum we owe each other in this society, hit that subscribe button and help us share stories like this with millions more. For a world where kindness doesn't need a condition and justice doesn't have to wait for a camera to roll.